Welcome to tonight's ACM talk, or Association of Computing Machinery. Tonight's talk is Smaller, Not Bigger Data, Securing in an Interconnected World. Our presenter will be Mollie Breen, co-founder and CEO of Perygee cybersecurity company. So a little bit of background about our organization. The San Francisco Bay Area ACM, we're a local professional chapter. We were founded in 1957, 10 years after ACM. We have a charter to promote knowledge of modern computing, like to create community, support networking and hiring. Only a $20 annual membership. Our dues are not supported by the central ACM. We aim to have 2 monthly meetings, a general computing meeting and a data science SIG or special interest group. We also like to support networking and job announcements. If you have a job announcement that's data science or security related, if you'd like to post it on the Zoom, on the chat or the questions, you can do that. And then some information, maybe others in the audience could follow up with you. So we're happy to support with that. Sometimes we have joint meetings with other societies like IEEE or other groups that are quite good. An upcoming webinar on April 19th, we have an improving AR and VR experiences by understanding the human visual system. So that's a person from Stanford University, and it's a joint meeting with SIGGRAPH. So you can use the Q&A in Zoom for questions to the speaker. I'll be your moderator. My name is Greg. And also the chat on YouTube for questions to the speaker via the panelists. So we have a call for volunteers. We have about a dozen volunteers that help run the organization. So you can start with a limited engagement. Volunteers can join us for a monthly dinner on the first Monday of the month. We haven't had the dinner in a while, being COVID, but it's something that we'd like to get back to. One of the things that we're looking for in a volunteer is support with membership services. So help with registration, other back office support, infrastructure, and also we can look for more member benefits to promote the SF Bay ACM chapter. Also, we would be interested in a publicity chair if you like to play with promotions or social media. Then that could be a separate role. So now to introduce tonight's speaker, Mollie Breen is co-founder and CEO of Perygee. Perygee is a cybersecurity company that offers a lightweight IoT and OT SaaS security platform. Had a $4.75 million in new seed financing in October 2022. Congratulations. That's always very exciting to get your funding. In this talk, we'll talk about real-world case studies and techniques for gathering and combining little and big data to better understand how to improve the resilience of IoT. Mollie was vulnerability and network exploration or exploitation analysis at the NSA, the first NSA mathematician in the Forensic Sciences Division at the U.S. Secret Service. She co-led the AI and machine learning portfolio for the chairman and the Joint Chief of Staff at Pentagon. She has an MBA from Harvard Business School, an MS in engineering from Harvard, and studied computer science from Duke University. And so now I'd like to turn it over to Mollie. So if we were in person, then I'd invite a warm round of applause. That's something we have to figure out how to do on Zoom a little bit better. Thank you very much. So I'll stop sharing.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Greg. And really excited to be here this evening. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. And I found out about ACM through somebody who helps lead up the chapter over in Boston. And tonight I'm talking to you all from Washington, D.C., but Perygee, the company that I founded, we spent a lot of time in San Francisco, and I go back and forth a lot. And Greg did such a great job with my background, but I've started the company. I'm the founder, CEO, coming from a math background where I looked at IoT devices from the offensive side and then left and started a company to help secure enterprises that are adopting IoT, Internet of Things devices. And one of the observations that I've had in founding the company and in talking to a lot of people out there that are adopting, this digital technology. So think security cameras. If we're in, an office type setting, think MRI machines. If we're in a hospital, think, conveyor belts. If we're in a manufacturing setting, it's just how vulnerable these devices are. And to secure them, there's a lot more that's needed than better algorithms, but really how do we help tune these algorithms over time? And so what we'll go through together today is these observations around the importance of little data. What is it? How do we get it? And as it applies to this very specific space that is, maybe you used to think of it as niche, but it's not so niche anymore. It's this space of digital transformation and how the entire world is getting connected. But I know that we've got a lot of people here coming from more than just hardware backgrounds or more than, only security backgrounds. And my hope would be that in the ways that you're just seeing data being aggregated and getting applied, that there'll be some insights that you can take back to your day-to-day, whether it's research or the companies that you work at. But just to give you a little bit of a sense of the type of world that I live and breathe every day, so that when we start getting into, big data and little data, you have some context for the examples that we're giving and the case studies that we're walking through. So if you haven't already realized, the physical world out there is getting stitched into a digital fabric. And what do we mean by that? It means the entire world is getting connected, and everything from the water that is coming into your house, if we're all sitting and working from home these days, like that water is getting processed and cleaned and filtered using chlorine sensors and pressure sensors and temperature thermometers in plants that are now connected to the internet. And in light of COVID and just the increase of demand on hospitals, we saw even more connected devices coming online to help keep up with the demand, from ventilators that are now connected to the internet to MRI machines, and the list goes on. So hopefully this gives you a picture of the world that we live in. And from a business perspective, and from the companies that are becoming the operators of this digital technology, there's actually this separation that is converging and is coming together. So traditionally, IT teams, information technology, is typically describing the management of data, the collection and the management of data, whether that's from computers, whether it's coming from servers. And operational technology, OT, you're going to hear me say that word a lot, is all of the people that were traditionally managing equipment and manufacturing plants, shop floors. And the problem that we're seeing, or maybe it's not as much of a problem or as an opportunity, is that the IT world, the management of data, the collection of data is getting combined with the equipment world, where they're now becoming really intertwined. And, you'll see this in, if you think of any type of, if we just take a manufacturing plant where everyone had to go home in light of COVID, and you had to deal with a lot fewer staff being able to come in and a lot fewer staff being able to work as closely together, you can start to get a sense of how powerful the ability to bring data in to help automate some of those processes became. And just to give you a sense of the scale that we're talking about, today, when you walk into some type of enterprise facility, over 30% of those devices are considered IoT devices. And the rest of that is, your PCs and your servers. And over time, every single day, there's 10 million new devices getting connected within these enterprises. And so it's no doubt that this will quickly overtake what we think of as this traditional IT world, as IoT, Internet of Things, operational technology starts to overtake it, and the entire world starts to get connected. There's a question, Greg. In the situation, I'll interrupt me if you think I should be answering these questions, but I'll keep going. Let's see. So to give a few examples, and I know I've given some so far. So we've talked about healthcare, we've talked about manufacturing, but just to give a sense of, those are typically the industries where we see the most digital technology coming online. Some of the places where you may not realize it is, if you ever walked into some type of retail chain, I won't name any names, but if you've done some online ordering system and you're going in and you're picking up your order at the front of the store, some of those retail chains are even using refrigerators to keep track of how long food has been in that refrigerator, to know if it's expired or not, or to let somebody know that, hey, you haven't picked it up. Or even in transportation, if you've flown on a plane recently, the the luggage that the scales that they use to track luggage getting on a plane, all of that is connected to the internet. And I was on a plane recently that said, hey, we're having a problem where this device is turned off. It's not connecting to the internet. We have to measure all of our luggage by hand. And we were very delayed. Just a sense of where this is, how all of this is becoming interconnected, whether you realize it or not. That's great, but there are some consequences that are coming into play. And those consequences of the IT side, this digital world being connected to this physical world, the OT side, it's a lot like oil and water, where IT has traditionally cared about confidentiality, integrity, security. OT has cared a lot more about availability and avoiding downtime. And as you start to mix these systems together, the teams are having to more regularly work together. And that's causing some real problems, both in terms of how do we share data? How do we share processes? How do we merge these cultures if we're going to start to build, hybrid teams, interdisciplinary teams? And that's difficult. And that sort of sets us up now to transition into talking about big data. So I know that a lot of people here know what big data is. It's been the buzz of the business world for years, with businesses across so many different industrial sectors gathering and analyzing this information in an effort to leverage these actionable insights. You're seeing this both on the IT side, where, they're monitoring equipment, and you can take a lot of data after you're monitoring equipment and better find, threat, malicious actors trying to get on the network when you've got a baseline of what normal of how a device behaves, and then you can start to detect anomalies a little bit better. Or you can start to see this even on the OT side, where they're using big data, they're using machine learning algorithms to continuously tune how well a security camera is adjusting and filtering images to get better readings and better insights from those feeds. And I'm sure if we pause here, and if you all think, I'm sure there's a lot of situations in your day-to-day, whether it's at your company or even just in your home or in your research, where you can see you can see big data coming together. And what we're going to spend the rest of the time talking about is how we don't necessarily have a big data problem today. We actually have a little data problem. And what do we mean by that? It essentially means that regardless of the type of data that we're using, whether we're talking about security data and monitoring, network traffic, whether we're talking about device data and the feeds coming off of it, it is really hard to go from any one of these really big pools of information into an action or into a very specific insight. And that's particularly important to keep in mind when we're talking about the IoT OT world, where we're dealing with these really critical environments where it's not a one size fits all approach, and being able to be very specific and be very actionable is important. And when you think about these IoT OT environments that I live and breathe every day, but when you walk into a hospital, you're living and breathing, and when you walk into a retail environment, you're sort of being surrounded by. The reason it's so hard to go from big data to some type of insight is because every single one of these devices is different based on the vendor. It's different based on the version. So you can have two Honeywell devices, two Rockwell devices of the same type. They can both be thermostats, but they can be totally different versions. They can be the same version, but just even when they were patched or how they're used can also start to differentiate, the overall ways in which you might want to apply action to it. So, and that delta between this one size fits all approach to taking some type of action, that delta, we think of it as that little data. It's the thing that's going to connect people to that insight. It's that last mile into action. And so as an example, we're looking at something like an Allen Bradley PLC. And maybe you don't know what Allen Bradley is, it's just a vendor. Maybe you've never heard of a PLC, a programmable logic controller. Just think of it as a pretty generic device that you find in manufacturing environments. And, a really typical scenario that you find in manufacturing environments is one of these devices will have a vulnerability. And big data is really good at helping to surface those vulnerabilities. Big data will be able to look across a lot of different data sources. It can look across feeds from the government. It can look across feeds from private sector. It can look across feeds from multiple different software sources. But to take an action and actually secure this vulnerability is so much easier said than done. So what people are doing in their day-to-day is they look at this vulnerability, and not only this one, but they're often looking at hundreds of vulnerabilities in any given day, and they have to decide, which of these devices and their vulnerabilities are the most important. Is a patch available? Should I just replace this device? And who is going to be the person that's ultimately responsible for patching it? And you start to get this picture that going from something like, hey, we've got a vulnerability, all the way to how do we actually implement this in our environment is a much more holistic process that doesn't rely on only big data. You also need that little data too. And we've talked to so many enterprises, and one of the things that we hear is, and have seen time and time again, is that the reality is only 97% of enterprises struggle getting value from this big data around IoT, OT in their environment. And we're here to make the case that the thing that's going to make the difference between 97% of enterprises not getting value, that is that little data. And I'm sure we could pause here and you can start to extrapolate about, again, we're talking a lot about IoT, OT environments, these really rich digital infrastructure, critical infrastructure type of environments. But I'd be willing to bet that enterprises everywhere, whether they're talking about critical infrastructure environments or not, are thinking about how do we make use of all of this big data, and that the next generation of tools are going to be thinking about how do we start to implement more little data. But if the solution is little data, and little data is the thing that makes going from big data into action, simple and easy to understand, the reality is that getting little data is anything but simple or easy. And we've boiled it down to a few reasons. So little data is really hard for reasons because it's coming from disparate systems. It's really unstructured. It's really undocumented. And just to go through each one of these. So disparate systems, what we think of when I mean it's being spread out, little data is across a lot of these different sources in these really critical environments. Things like who owns a device, who purchased it, how often is it used. All of that lives across a lot of different software, but it also lives across people's emails, like who was the person that bought it. That's probably going to live in some email somewhere. It also just lives behind, on people's desks, like, oh, the person who last did maintenance on this device. And it can also just live in people's mental model. And you start to get this picture of just how far and wide this information is spread. And then the second reason is little data is often really unstructured. So it's not as easy as say you had all the time in the world to find this little data spread out across all of these different systems. Even if you did all of that, it's still going to be really unstructured. Something like location is actually, a really big problem. I've worked with hospitals in the past that have spent a year just figuring out how do they reconcile the fact that a clinical engineer, the people who touch the MRI machines and move them between rooms, thinks of location as a room, whereas facilities may think of location as a building or a wing, and security and networking thinks of location as a subnet. And you start to understand how, just even if you could have all this information in one place, there's not a shared understanding of what it means. And finally, a lot of this information is just undocumented and is living across a lot of these different information silos that is not only inaccessible from, between teams, but there's also a lot of situations where we've seen little data is just being built up through institutional knowledge. So I once spoke to somebody in facilities who helped to manage HVAC equipment, and HVAC equipment is connected to the internet and it has the problem of occasionally going down. And I asked this facilities manager, so what do you do when this goes down? And he said, oh, I always call so-and-so whenever this goes down. And I asked, him, what are you going to do if you're ever out for a day? Like, who's going to know who to call? And you start to build up this picture that there's not a shared understanding for, or not a shared resource for where they can go and find that little data when they want to respond to a big data event like, hey, we've looked across and we can tell this HVAC is going down or it's about to go down. There's still a missing insight about who to call and what to do about it. And, say you're bought in and you've got a sense of what big data is, how it's relating to little data, just to give a few real consequences of where the lack of little data has really impacted these different operational environments. And both of these events are coming from NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and they put out this special guide on operating these critical environments and some of the things that can go wrong. So first incident number one, what you're looking at is a fire that happened at NASA. And NASA did this thing where they implemented a security patch. And when you implement a security patch, you're essentially updating devices. And what they did, though, is they implemented it uniformly across all of their OT environment. And that included this operational component that happened to control a very large engineering oven. And the security patch that they were implementing caused a reboot of the oven, and that made the oven stop running, which led to a fire that destroyed spacecraft hardware, and it ultimately meant that the surrounding alarm activation meant that the fire went undetected for 3.5 hours. And in that situation, you start to build this picture of they implemented this one size fits all event, but without the proper security controls and without the proper precision and awareness of what they were impacting, led to this really sad outcome for NASA. And in the second scenario, we're looking at a wafer factory. So in this situation, the action that they were taking is they were doing this thing called a ping sweep, where you essentially you essentially are scanning the network, looking for hosts on the network for inventory purposes. It's a technique that you use just to kind of understand what is out there. Does it respond when I ping this? And if it does, then I have a sense of what is on my network. And the problem is these ping sweeps, these scans can be kind of noisy. It can be pretty disruptive, especially if you don't put in the right controls and take into account the right context of what the environment that they're in. And so in this situation, in this wafer factory, they did this ping sweep, and it ended up hitting one of their integrated circuits within the plant. And when they hit this circuit, it caused the circuit to hang, meaning it just stopped responding. And that result of it just causing that part of the line to go down resulted in the loss of $50,000 worth of wafers. And again, you see this commonality where these actions could have been more precise. They could have been taking into account more context, like what is in this environment, how is it being used, what's going to be impacted, what's the resulting business outcome. And the more and more that we live in this more interconnected world, the more we realize that every system is just getting larger and more complex. And we actually need to make it easier to handle that complexity. And making it easier to handle that complexity is where little data can start to come, is really important and starts to come to light. And as we start now to transition into some of these case studies and talking about how do we get this little data, I think it can be helpful just to take a look at a couple of examples of, the big data insight and how little data helps to, take a big data insight and turn it into action. And, that can be things like a new vulnerability, which is coming from a big data insight, something like changes in performance on a particular device. So monitoring, is this device, performing how it should be, or something like inventory maintenance. And you may have heard of a type of industry called predictive maintenance, which is kind of looking at how equipment is being used to understand, can we predict when it would need to be maintained? And if we just take this example of a new vulnerability, and we referred to this a little bit earlier, where we saw these examples of any time you have a new vulnerability, in order to understand whether or not you want to patch it, it actually requires a little bit more information that you have to go out and find. And some of that information can include, just reaching out to the vendor and saying, hey, do I patch this or do you patch this? In all of our Apple iPhones, we're the ones that are responsible for patching it. We have to click on the update button. In the browser that I'm using, Google is saying I need to be responsible for updating that. But in enterprise environments, there's actually a lot of situations where you buy a lot of security cameras and the security camera vendor is going to be the one patching it. And so that's an example of where little data is important to stepping in and knowing, what do we do with this new vulnerability? Or in the cases of something like changes in performance, it's really important to know, hey, this device is performing differently. Some of you all may know about the Stuxnet, this very famous hack that happened with the Iranian centrifuges. And one of the really key indicators that went unnoticed with the Iranian centrifuges is that the worm that was hacking the Iranian centrifuges was actually speeding up and slowing down the centrifuges so that they ended up needing to be replaced a lot more quickly than they otherwise would have been. So that's a really useful insight that big data can help detect, that could have, for the Iranians, could have prevented against this really embarrassing attack. But in all of these situations, little data is going to be really important to understand, where is this device located? Does equipment in this particular location have different readings that we need to take account for? Are they used more often? Is this building under construction? That can impact, how it's being used. And the commonality across all of these is that as we live in a more combined security and operations world, it's actually, and it's bringing in even more people than just security and operations. We're starting to bring in additional stakeholders like engineering and procurement and facilities. And to be able to live in a world where we're making the best use of big data and using little data, we have to first confront these data silos that are existing across the organization. And so now, as we jump into talking a little bit more about, how do we help encourage organizations to adopt little data best practices, one of the things that we'll start to see as a common thread is, how do we at every single step of the way start to confront these different silos and start to help organizations stitch together the data that they're using, the processes that they're using, and stitch together the people that are working around it. And so as a first step, and this is extremely important to keep in mind, is that you're not going to be able to get all the little data you need upfront. So in an IT/OT context, you're not going to get the little data that you need for all of your critical infrastructure. And similarly, if we're talking about any type of application for a big data algorithm, you're probably not going to get all the little data upfront either. And so it's really important that you just pick a single process to get started around, and we'll give some examples of this. And as you think about a single process, take into account, what is really critical today, what is taking us the most time, and, gather the surrounding stakeholders, understand where the urgency is. And because those are, if you start with a process that's really critical, that's going to be the thing that ensures that you can see this process all the way through. If you start with something that is not as urgent, you may not get all the benefit from starting from big data and getting all the little data around it. And so in an IoT/OT context, some of those examples can mean things like maybe you're trying to map out all the asset owners, meaning you're in a manufacturing setting and you want to know who owns all of the security cameras and who owns all of the thermostats and who owns all the humidifiers. Or another process that we've seen folks start with is something like location, and just trying to get a sense of what do I have and where is it located? And with that, you want to just try to map out the entire process as much as possible. And remember that as you're mapping out that entire process, include things that go beyond everything that you just see. If you're trying to map out how you go from, hey, I found this device on my network and I need to understand where it's located, really try to understand not just the next person you ask, but think about, the next 2-3 hops all the way until you get to a single answer, and try to bring in as much of the missing elements that you think are going to need to be a part of this process as possible. And also don't forget that it may not be only people that you're going to need to bring in, but keep in mind that it may fall across different types of systems. Some of those systems you may not realize that you've been using. So maybe you always reach out to the same person over email or over chat. Like those are all the things you want to start to take account for as you start to map out what it is that you're going to be using to start to bring in some of this little data. And then with that in mind, and with all of the process in mind and some of this data that you're going to need mapped out, the next thing that you want to do is remember that you want to make this as integrated as possible. And this step is so much easier said than done. And so however you choose to standardize on bringing a lot of this data together, remember that it should be really flexible and easier to use. I think that the places where we see organizations start to see some drift in this process, or maybe not adopt it as fully as they could have, is they didn't start with a system that was really easy to use, or they didn't start with a system that was really flexible. And I'm sure we've all had situations where you're using a system and you have to export it into Excel just to add more data to it. And then of course, Excel starts to have a number of different versions as it gets shared. So all the better if you can start with one system that can hold all of this data that's both easy to use and flexible. And after that, this is another step that we see folks get wrong, is they do the planning piece of what data we need, then they do this integration piece, and they figured out a way to keep their data together that's both flexible and easy, but then they neglect on how to think about how they're going to update this process over time. So something like location is easy enough to take to identify what data you need and bring it all together to understand where all your devices are at once. But after you do that once, you recognize that these devices can move all the time. And in your process, you want to find a way to make sure that it's continually being updated over time. And Greg, I see you brought your video on. So do you want to, is this a good stopping point to answer some questions?
Yeah. One question from someone anonymous: how to deal with live stream IoT data with lots of data? So I imagine that could be high volume, high sample rate, many IoT sources.
So how do you deal with when you have a lot of, when you have I think what I'm hearing is when we talk about IoT and OT, these devices produce a ton of data, whether that's them producing a lot of readings coming, when they're sensing in an environment. I come from a networking world, so I also see them produce a lot of real-time just traffic pattern and internet traffic. Like these things are phoning home all the time. And you have to reconcile that with some of this, really sparse what I would call little data, things like location and who owns it. And the reality is not a lot of systems do this well. Excel obviously doesn't do this well. Excel does the little data well. And then there's some big systems that do, or then there's, maybe you go out and you procure software that does more of that big data well, like they're drawing a lot of real-time traffic or real-time readings from these live streams. And a lot of the things that we see is that those systems don't talk to each other well. And a lot of the work that we do, but also what we're championing in this is how we even just recognizing that those things don't talk is don't talk well, and that there's a missing link. And today it's a lot of people, and maybe in the future there'll be some technology that will help with it. Is the challenge. So you're asking the right question, and the answer is there's not a great answer, unless you want to learn more about Perygee, which I will not do on this call. I can do it afterwards, but it's a really good question.
One of the people was asking, for your talk, what are you defining as small data and big data? I'm sure that kind of changes over the decade, but with respect to what you're covering.
Absolutely. So when I think of big data, I think of it as the aggregation. It can be the aggregation of little data for sure. So maybe I'll start with the definition of little data. When I think of little data, I just think of it as like in a very specific sense, I think of it as the information that can live in an Excel spreadsheet that you can read and you immediately understand, and it's the thing that is actionable. And big data can be the aggregation of little data. You can look across 1,000 different locations of devices and draw some insights around where devices are typically located. But nonetheless, big data is still by definition incomprehensible to the human eye and has to be interpreted by a computer. And so that's where I start to draw the line. Is it's this aggregation of a lot of insights, which it may be little data, it may just be aggregation of big data or machine readings that we typically wouldn't read on their own. And little data is the thing that makes it actionable.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. Any other questions that make sense at this time?
I was going to say, on your integration, one of the points that's very big is there's so many different standards. There's so many different vendors making these devices. So, there's MQTT, Modbus, OPC-UA, OPC-DA, and you go to another industry like medical devices, and I'm sure they have their own several dozen standards of communication. So that integration is just huge to be able to deal with.
Absolutely. And I think consolidation is something we hear from everyone as being extremely important. And I think that in big data to little data as a trend or as a phenomenon is interesting in a lot of different industries. In IoT, OT, it's especially interesting because we're dealing with these critical environments and because we're dealing with this convergence of these teams starting to come together. So you mentioned MQTT and these different standards. Security's got its own. They're all trying to figure out how to work together. And this is why how we've seen this play out, it's really important to start with a single process. So starting with like just one, if you're working within an enterprise and you're trying to standardize on, a new risk framework, don't pick 3 different risk frameworks to start with. Pick one risk framework to start with, and think about the data and the systems that need to come together for that one, and then build up into these other different standards incrementally over time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And that's actually a really good segue into some of the other points to make here. So as you think about embedding, updating the collection of little data into these processes, one thing that can actually be really helpful, which can sound like a thing that may cause some friction up front, is putting in permissions around the data. So who can read, write, and edit which cells. And the reason that that's really important is it not only creates some clarity around who owns what and how you're going to start to work off of a shared data layer, but it can also just help with keeping the data clean and making sure that Phillips with one L isn't spelled Phillips with one L and Phillips and 2 L's aren't, in the same spreadsheet. Those are actually 2 different vendors, but we see all the time people refer to them and treat them as one and the same. And then finally, remembering that, and this is great, Greg, just from your most recent question, remembering that collecting things like little data to go from big data into this action is an evolution, and it's going to be an evolution in 2 ways. So the first one is you've ideally started with a single process, and so it will inevitably have gaps. So you're going to have forgotten to collect some data. You're going to get to the end and be like, oh my goodness, wouldn't it be so much better if we also knew this thing and it could be so much faster? And you're going to want to fill in those gaps over time. And then the second one is if you've picked just one process, then your goal is to also grow from that one process into, the additional processes, and starting to make use of all of this information that any enterprise or company is using, and turning that into actions. And just a couple of ways that I've seen companies start to find these gaps and identify them. There's two ways that I like to recommend. So the first one is, if you're using a collaboration tool like Slack or Teams or even Discord, if you're coming from some of the more like gaming communities, setting up a channel that says that where people can post and say, hey, for finding this device's location, or for figuring out who owned this thing, I actually had to go and ask this person, and it didn't live within this typical process that we had standardized on. How do we update this process to catch this edge case or catch this type of device that we may have forgotten about? That's one example. Another way that I've seen folks do it, and that we've encouraged, is you can just set up a reoccurring meeting that addresses some of the processes that you have in place for collecting this little data, and coming back to that meeting, that maybe it's monthly, maybe it's quarterly, and adjusting some of these processes, and remembering that when this is done right, the process will grow across different types of data, different types of technology, and also the types of people that you would be bringing into it over time. And so finally, now walking through an example, just to help really clarify what we mean by going from this big data into little data, and how you can start to implement these best practices and all of the things that we've talked about into place. So I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of different companies and help them with securing their IoT, OT devices, but doing it in a way that helps to bridge these different parts across different organizations from across the company. And in one of the organizations that we were working with, they had this really painful process today. And that painful process had to do with onboarding new IoT, OT devices. So what do we mean by that? So somebody on operations, they've got this sprinkler system, and they're trying to get it installed that day because the vendors pulled up with all of the sprinklers, and they need to get it set up because they're paying this vendor. And it also, we now live in a modern world, and so the sprinkler system is also connected to the internet. And so they would call the networking team and say, hey, the vendor is here right now. I don't know what you have to do, but you have to get this thing online for us. And of course, the networking team is like, wait, you've given us zero time. The vendor is here. I need to figure out who's going to own this thing? Where is it located? What IP addresses should it have? When is it going to come online? And they have to figure out, have we even bought from this vendor before? And they try to get all that information as much as possible. It's a whole bunch of back and forth over the phone, and it's a whole bunch of back and forth over email. And even after all of that, they still have to submit it for approval into IT. And if you've ever waited for IT to approve anything, you know that they're always backlogged. They're always overwhelmed. And so, of course, this vendor that is here right now is still waiting to install this sprinkler system because we're pinging IT. We're pinging IT to finally approve this device and see if we can get this thing online. And if that process alone wasn't painful enough, and I hope you can hear some of the ways in which there's a lot of, little data that's starting to percolate there, where they're finding it in real time, like they're trying to identify this information. Anytime a device goes down from then on, so, fast forward a year, fast forward 2 years, and this sprinkler system that no one remembers what day it came on, and no one remembers who they talked to, when that sprinkler system goes down, they have to kind of reverse engineer this entire process, where operations will call networking and be like, this is going down. We don't know why. And networking is like, wait, we have to figure out, how did this get here? Who do we call? And I'm sure we've all had these situations where we've had to remember what we typed in an email to try to recall what the information was. And you're trying to guess the subject line. You're putting quotes around like 2 words that happen to be very common across all of your emails. And it's no surprise that this is also an extremely painful process, and it slows down, it slows down everything from their ability to adopt new technology to their ability to respond to some of these, big data events, like some downtime on the network or even a malicious actor. And it really doesn't go far enough in terms of automating some of this collection of little data that would have been really helpful in the moment. And Greg, I see you've turned on your camera, so I'll pause there and see if you have any questions.
When you get to a good stopping point, a couple of questions came in on the Q&A.
Yeah.
So one from an anonymous person. We used to hear so much about RFID. It doesn't seem like so much anymore. What's the role of technologies like this, or what are its successors, GPS, in making location more accessible, automated, or standardized? So that was one question.
Oh, interesting. What is the role of FRID in making location data more standardized? Man, let me start with some of the problems that I've seen with location data. So I've worked with some hospitals where they put like RFID tags on equipment to be able to find it. And it's a combination of RFID and Bluetooth, but whatever it is at this hospital, they just talk about how often those technologies run out of batteries. And then they're sort of left with this situation where they don't know where it's located, and they don't know where it's located, and it's lost its batteries. So it's like their foreseeable solution isn't working. And that's one problem that I've heard in this situation. The other type of problem I've heard is somehow organizations end up with 2 or 3 different types of location tracking. So maybe they've got a combination of FRID and Bluetooth, and add a third one that's somewhat redundant in all of that. And I think that there is a lot of there is a real observation that they need to adopt these technologies, but I think that there's still a big delta between their ability, again, going back to that consolidation piece, where it's still really hard to bring it together and actually make use of that information. And just from my vantage point, it seems like the past decade or so has been about how do we get as much data as possible. And that's awesome. I'm glad we've lived in a world where we've gotten there. And I think that we're going to start to see a shift, and I would love to see a shift where it's, we'll continue to be on this journey of getting as much data as possible, but we'll really help start to position ourselves into helping organizations make the most use of that data. And consolidating 3 different types of location tracking may be one of those examples.
Okay. Another question came in from Saraf. Does Perygee check IoT device data patterns, especially if it's related to safety?
Yes, this is one. So I'll give an example of like a use case we've seen. So because safety is really important. So one of the use cases we've seen is in a kind of like a data center type of industry. They have folks that are wearing hard hats, and those hard hats are now getting connected to the internet, so that when there's some type of emergency, they can use those hard hats to track people and get a much better sense in real time of like, do we have everybody, did we get everybody out in the efforts of safety, which is awesome. But of course, even just being able to track something as small as, hey, we ordered 1,200 hard hats. Did all of those 1,200 hard hats turn on in the vein that we expected them to? Are there 100 hard hats that are not being used that we can either repurpose for additional people, or are there 100 hard hats that we could actually save some money on from like an equipment utilization that we aren't using? And all that type of visibility around utilization and where it's getting assigned to is just one example of where you see this intersection of something that's being used for safety that's still maybe not as optimized as it could have been. And that's just one example where we would help step in and help them give that visibility into how they can further maximize the safety around this device that is serving a really important purpose.
Mm-hmm. And then just a comment on your current slide, one of the things that would help with a lot of that is a building management system. If you have a central software system that handles security, fire suppression, all sorts of other types of things, HVAC, temperature control in a centralized store. Then as you add something, you don't have to remember it. It's in the central software system. That'll make it much easier.
Absolutely. But what we find is it gets added to the building automation management system. But then maybe security doesn't know about it. And so that's or engineering doesn't know about it. Let's say, so in some situations, security will say, we don't know about it. In the case of a hospital, for example, maybe the HVAC device gets added to the building management system, but what they don't realize is that HVAC device is actually on the same network as the NICU. And now you've got a situation where you want to be really careful about, can this HVAC device do something malicious to this NICU and risk real patient outcomes? So it really comes back to
the general audience might not know what a NICU is.
Oh, sorry. It's where they keep babies in hospitals. It's like where babies go as they're recovering in hospitals. Anyway, so just like a very critical place where you wouldn't want to have any type of downtime.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions at this moment?
No other questions.
Great.
Thank you.
Cool. So when we've gone through this, hopefully painted this picture of this extremely painful process that, maybe before today, you never thought about how hard it would be to onboard a sprinkler system or a security camera into a single company, but you see this picture of all the things it has to touch, all the information that gets collected, and how all that information gets used down the road that without tracking the little data and all of it just becomes really painful and really gets in the way of the business. So in sitting down with this organization and really understanding, what is it that they're trying to accomplish? Like we walked through those steps that we just walked through together. So the first thing we did was we just mapped out what is all the data that they wish they had on every single device before it was added to the network, and they wish they had when they were doing and responding to some of these events like downtime, like some type of security threat, and even figured out, who is the person that's going to be responsible for it, starting to put into place some of those permissions. And the thing that we helped them do is we essentially just built a form, like a checklist, and you can think of it as a Google form. And it essentially asked these questions up front as people were, instead of going to the network engineer and calling them and saying, hey, we've got this vendor and this sprinkler system that needs to get online right away. They'd fill out this form with the vendor who's on site, and they would put this information all into one place. And this form was a little smarter than a Google form in that you could have certain permissions around what data could be edited and by who. And so then as they, it would be easily then passed on from the operational person, the vendor, the network engineer, all the way up to IT for approval. And it essentially took what was an hours and often, honestly, days process of collecting this information from multiple stakeholders down to just about 15 minutes. And even more than just automating this thing that could take up to a week into 15 minutes or less, the real value add also continued to build on that when, a year later or 2 years later, where anytime something went down, something really critical, instead of having to sort of peel back the layers of memory and try to understand and work from little bits and pieces like, okay, this IP address is in this system, which makes me think it must go to this person that I need to ask for advice. All of that information was in one place so that they could essentially see, great, this is the hardware rep vendor I need to call. This is the operations person that needs to be on this device that's down. And it really started to merge this, the connection from, us in networking or in security at the time or in operations that are looking at big data could much more quickly then move into, these are the decisions that we need to be made and how we're going to respond using the little data through this best practices and how they approach the process in collecting it. Great. Well, this is the last slide. So I can answer any questions now, Greg, or I can just wrap up and then, we can answer all the questions all at once.
Another question did come in.
Okay.
from an anonymous person. How might it be easier for a small business to manage through all these little and big data issues?
Yes. So, man, this is an issue so near and dear to my heart. How would a small business be able to better manage for the difference between big data and little data? Without knowing too much about the business and whether we're talking about an IoT OT context or something else, I do think that one of the things that we see a lot, I mean, if I just go back to the problem, is that predominantly people overinvest in big data and get super excited and be like, oh my gosh, we've got all these analytics, and often underinvest in the little data piece. So I think that if I were going to give advice to a small business, is think about balancing the big data and the little data at the same time at every stage. And so instead of being like, oh, I'm going to get all this big data first and then figure out the little data later, think about how do you build from, start with some big data. Maybe you're going to, maybe you're a small business and you just want to look at big data around revenue. Maybe you're looking at IoT, OT devices. And instead of getting all the big data all at once, start with just one: performance, availability, et cetera, and then map out what is the little data that's actually going to make going from some type of insight into action, and then build incrementally from there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
No other outstanding questions at the time.
Great. Well, just to summarize, very, very bullish on the big data world that we're living in. Don't want to leave anybody with the sense that it's the world that big data is, that we somehow don't like big data, love big data. But I think that, and it's not going away. I think that, even just similar to the note that we just ended on with this final question, is it's really important to supplement big data with little data, and remembering the importance of each. And especially in a community like this, where we've probably got a lot of data scientists in the room, and people who just use data all the time, and you're probably using little data too, and it's just a matter of being aware of it and recognizing how can you use it to unlock even better insights from that big data. And particularly in the IoT OT segment, which I'm super passionate about, there's a big opportunity, no pun intended, to use the combination of big data and little data to get to increase the upside in terms of business efficiencies and innovation, while also minimizing the downside in terms of security events and mitigating the risk within an organization. And some of the things that we've talked about so far, that just to summarize, include how the combination of big data and little data help to lead to better response time in these security events and some type of downtime. It can help to decrease unknown threats. It can help people get more done, automating something that took 7 days to just 1 day. Helping around things like equipment utilization, that safety use case that we talked about, and even just getting more out of the tools that you've already gotten. So that concludes everything that I was excited to share with you all today, but of course, happy to answer any other questions with the time that we have left.
Quick question came in: is what does Perygee stand for?
Oh, Perygee is perigee with an I is when the moon is closest to the body that it orbits. So when our moon is closest to the Earth, it's perigee. And Perygee, the company, takes a very device-specific approach. We really understand context for every single thing that we secure. So that illustration of the moon being close to the body that it orbits is how we came up with the name. And then we changed it to a Y because it was a lot cheaper on GoDaddy to get it with a Y. It was like a penny. And with an I, it was like going to be $20,000 if you could even get it. And, when you're a startup, you're like, all right, Y it is.
Well, being more unique is your part
Exactly.
of your branding, right? Yeah. Another question just came in. In a small business, can you think of a case where I just start with little data throughout and not have to touch big data?
Man, can I think of a case? Absolutely. Again, I don't want to poo-poo on big data because I think it's really powerful, but I don't think it's a bad idea to start with little. I think organizations all the time. I'm trying to think of an example where, okay, so an example would be we walk into organizations all the time that just have no idea what's on their network. I mean, I think about even my own home, and it's like, how many smart plugs do I have? I could probably go and count by room, but yeah, I have to sit here and visualize it. And you take that and you extrapolate, and organizations have no idea. It's the Wild West. Things are getting added all the time. In a university setting, professors just want to bring in some whatever it is that's going to help their classroom. They want to bring Alexas into their offices. And the same is true as in hospitals, where doctors want to bring Alexas in to listen to music for their surgery. So a way to start with little data is, just taking an inventory, which from my point of view, that's little data. And then maybe you go from there and you start to say, let's just prioritize what our most important things are and make sure that we're putting in the right safety metrics around it. We're making sure that those things are available for whatever our revenue generating operations are of this company. And I think you could get pretty far on just little data. And eventually you'd probably get the urge to start putting big data, but I don't think there's any rush. Again, I think we as a world have put a lot of stake into big data, and we're all about, reminding people the value of little data.
Okay, another question came in from an anonymous person. Is there increased risk with bringing this little data together? And if so, how do you manage it? For example, how a PLC used for the uranium centrifuge can be distinguished from those used in some mundane application, or responsible technicians can now be identified and targeted with social engineering because all this info is in one place as opposed to spreadsheets, emails, whiteboards, etc.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Wow, I'm going to say three different things. So the first one would be, I think if you were to take into account the risk, when you take into account risk, you also have to take into account what are you gaining. And for any organization, they probably have to ask themselves, how much time are we losing? How much risk are we inheriting by not keeping this information together? And are we willing to inherit are we willing to inherit the risk of moving it together in exchange for all the benefit that you would get by bringing it together? That's like sort of one point that I'd be willing to bet in every organization they would see it through a lens of all the value they would get off of it. But it is worth considering. I think the second piece that I thought of as you were asking this question is you were thinking about, the question was sort of through this lens of, does this become a target? Does this become, this incredible asset, this incredible rich data source that would make hackers more likely to target it? I also thought about the risk through the lens of moving all this information together can also just increase the chances for errors. And so, let's just say you standardize on a spreadsheet where everyone updates whenever they move a device in this spreadsheet. Well, all of a sudden, that gets really unruly because, of course, you're dealing with versioning of the spreadsheet. You're dealing with people misspelling things, accidentally typing in the spreadsheet when they meant to be typing in a Teams box. That is a real risk. And that's why putting in some data controls, some auditability, being able to audit cells and look at histories, you get a little bit fancier. I'm talking a little bit more about some of the technology that we think about in preventing against that. And then this third way around bringing information together that I was thinking of is absolutely, I think that this would bring some type of risk, and no solution is 100% secure. But so as you would bring all this information together, take into account, is where are you storing it? And where is that information in transit? So if it's something like an Excel spreadsheet that you're tossing around, maybe don't put it over email, since email isn't secure. Maybe keep it in a secure location and let people access it from there directly. If you're using a software to put it in somewhere, keeping in mind, does that software have some type of security policy on that third bucket? But it's a really good question.
Hashem asks, is there a white paper that describes the use cases you're addressing?
Yeah, not we have a white paper that I'd be more than happy to share. Not one exactly for this talk. This talk is still new, but you're inspiring me to want to write one. But we've got a white paper that would talk more about the company that I could also share.
Sometimes people ask for slides after the fact. If you feel like posting a PDF version on the Meetup site, in the very bottom of there's a discussion thread. And so if you post a link there for either a PDF of your slides, or if you have existing white paper, whatever you'd like to share, then that'd be a good place to share and other people can go back to and find.
Yeah, absolutely.
There was another comment in the chat relating to digital twins. Did you cover much on that?
I know a lot about digital twins, and I didn't cover it as much, but let's see. My thoughts on digital twins is I do think that like digital twins are a really interesting intersection of these two things, where you're using a ton of big data to ultimately generate some little data of like how this device behaves, how would it react. And I think that digital twins, I'd have to check where we are in terms of the adoption cycle. I think I know they're being used. I know folks are using digital twins and have even digital factories. That's probably not attainable for every company out there. And so, thinking about the best practices about going from big data and little data, you're probably on, a future iteration of that, or the next generation of that is getting you even closer to digital twins. So you could almost think of this talk as sort of a stepping stone for companies that want to do digital twin, but that's a really big leap. And these are some of the ways to implement some of those best practices on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, a lot of times you can think of a digital twin as just a simulator of a system. Given the same inputs, what outputs does it produce, and how can you perturb it? Do a design of experiments.
Yeah, exactly.
Somebody's asking, what is a digital twin?
Oh, well, Greg, you did a great job explaining it. But so Greg just shared it's let's see. You're seeing it a lot with IoT. I'm trying to think if it has applications outside of IoT. I guess it does, because people are digital twinning factories, but it's essentially taking a system, whether that system is IoT or whether that system is a factory floor, and creating a virtual replica of it, the digital part, a digital twin, and feeding it with a bunch of data so that it can essentially mimic the response of that system, whether it's a device, whether it's a factory floor, and be able to predict what the outcome is. So in a factory floor, I'm trying to think how factories use digital twins. I think it's to like be able to do predictive maintenance more easily, understand dependencies, be able
supply chain.
Yeah, supply chain, supply chain impacts. And it's a really powerful way to get those business insights without obviously having to go through it in the real world.
I mean, you can think of many video games as like a digital twin of whatever they're trying to simulate. So think of it as a simulator that is something that you can use to explore. And then if you're trying to optimize something or reduce costs, be more energy efficient, or figure out your downtime. Somebody else was saying, thanks, Greg and Molly. How could we stay connected? So
here, is it, what's the best? I can put my email in the chat, or we can send an email afterwards with my email and your email, or et cetera.
Yeah, it says anonymous, so we don't have a way of connecting them. But if you want to share it in the Q&A, you can just type an answer there. Well, very good. Thank you for your time, Molly. Thanks for a good presentation. We are very happy to have you.
It's great to meet everyone, engage with you all this evening, and looking forward to staying in touch.
Sounds good. Okay. Thank you very much. We'll call tonight's meeting over. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.